60 seconds.
Landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
50 down at 2.5.
We hadn't even gone into orbit.
13 minutes to the moon from the BBC World Service. Coming soon.
Hello, I'm Manuela Saragossa. Welcome to Business Daily from the BBC. Coming up, the words that strike fear into the heart of any private landlord: rent control.
Rents have gone up way above what people have been earning. We want to make sure the increases don't go on at such a rate in the future.
We're asking why affordable housing is such a persistent and apparently intractable problem for so many cities. Is there a solution?
It's a very simple problem, and there's actually some pretty basic solutions to get us out of it, but they seem to be politically difficult to execute.
That's all here in Business Daily from the BBC. Housing is expensive and often downright unaffordable for many ordinary workers in cities around the world, which may explain why the idea of rent control is back in vogue. The US state of Oregon passed a law this February to cap rent increases at 7% plus inflation. Colorado and New York are considering similar measures. Rent control is also back on the political agenda in California this week. And here in London, the mayor, Sadiq Khan, is looking into rent control too. That's after a poll showed that more than 2/3 of Londoners want the government to cap how much landlords can charge their tenants. The BBC's Mike Johnson has this report.
Hi, Leanna. Hi, it's Mike from the BBC.
Good to meet you.
How are you? Leanna Etkind shows me round her one-bedroom apartment in Forest Hill in South London.
This is my flat. A little hallway, bathroom and shower. This is our bedroom. Lots of bookshelves on the walls.
34-year-old Leanna is one of the 2.5 million people who now rent privately in the British capital. For her, life as a London renter can be stressful and precarious.
Landlords definitely have the upper hand. They know that in most places in London, if they move you on, there's going to be like 10 or 20 people ready and willing to take that space.
In a previous apartment, Leanna was faced with an increase of almost 40% in her rent. She couldn't afford it and she was evicted. She now wants to see legal limits put on rent rises.
The way things are at the moment, it just is so unfair to renters, who are a growing part of the population demographically. It makes me feel powerless. I feel generally in life I have choices and I move my life ahead. But when it comes to where I live, I don't have any power.
Well, I can't go home because I haven't got a cent. Man, I can't even pay my rent. I have the rent day blues.
Now Leanna has an ally, London's Mayor Sadiq Khan. He and his team have announced they will press the UK government to reintroduce rent controls first brought in during World War I and only fully abandoned in the late 1980s.
Radical change is long overdue. People need real help now.
James Murray is Deputy London Mayor with responsibility for housing.
If you look at the pattern over the last 10, 15 years, rents have gone up way above what people have been earning. People are spending far more of their income on rents. Crucially, we want to make sure that we have a system of rent control to make sure the increases we've seen over many years don't go on at such a rate in the future.
Plenty of countries already have some form of rent control, including France, Germany and Spain. So do big US cities like New York, Washington, Los Angeles and San Francisco. Models vary. It might be a cap on rent rises within tenancies, so people like Leanna couldn't be forced out by huge increases. More radical would be to limit rises between tenancies as well, a move supported by the UK's opposition Labour Party. But is rent control really such a good idea?
It's really a terrible idea. Rent control causes shortages of housing. It causes housing to deteriorate. Ultimately, it's bad for both landlords and tenants.
Mark Joffe is from the Reason Foundation, a Los Angeles research group which favours free markets. Lawmakers in the US states of Illinois and Oregon are now considering bills which could lead to new rent controls. He's alarmed at the prospect.
I grew up in New York, so for me, the experience with rent control is quite real. The landlord income is limited, but at the same time, the landlord is almost certain to be able to get a tenant. So that means the landlord doesn't really have to invest in the quality of the apartment. By the 70s and 80s, it was really obvious that rent control was causing very serious problems in New York. Landlords had no incentive to maintain the buildings, and apartments were really allowed to seriously deteriorate. Dangerous situations were allowed to develop. It's the obvious thing to do, but it's economically not the right thing to do. The right thing to do is to allow developers to build enough capacity so that competition will bring prices down.
I've come now to Bermondsey in East London and the site of a former biscuit factory. The production line here shut down in the late 1980s, and now the site is earmarked for development, including more than 1,200 new flats. With me is Hannah Slater of the campaign group Generation Rent, which supports the idea of rent control. Hannah Slater, if you have more of something, the price of it usually goes down. Wouldn't building more homes be the best approach rather than trying to dictate how much landlords can charge?
That's a great idea in theory, but look at what's happening here. The development here has stalled. The plans keep getting rejected by local politicians because it simply doesn't contain enough affordable housing. Families actually need affordable rents now, so we need to look at different forms of rent regulation and see what could work here.
That report by Mike Johnson here in London. Well, one city that already has a form of rent control is Berlin in Germany. In the past, those rent caps there have allowed communities of cash-strapped artists to flourish, helping Berlin earn its reputation of being, as one former city mayor put it, poor but sexy. But recently, renting in Berlin has become less affordable. So what's going on? Well, Tom McGath speaks for an affordable living campaign group called Deutsche Wohnen und Eigenen.
There's something called a rent break, which means that you can only raise the rent, I think, by about 15% every 3 years. But there are certain exceptions to this rule. So there's a law that was passed nationally a few years ago that is all about modernizing energy efficiency. So what a lot of renters do actually is they do very cheap renovations, and they are allowed to raise the rent much more.
Ways of getting round that rent control then. These days there are many more big private-owned developers in Berlin's housing market. And Tom McGrath's campaign group now wants the local authority to take control of some 200,000 privately owned apartments in the city.
You have a very fragmented housing market. However, there are quite a lot of big players in the market as well. So this is something that's unique compared to London, where the largest landlord in London only has around 3,000 apartments. In Berlin, it's Deutsche Wohnen with 110,000 apartments. So through our campaign, we would basically say that any landlords that have 3,000 or more apartments would be expropriated, and then their apartments
nationalised, essentially.
Nationalized, yes, essentially. But it's not national because it would go into Berlin's control, so it would be municipal control for the purpose of socialization, which means that these would be public housing after they had been expropriated.
I mean, it's quite a radical solution. How exactly would nationalisation help?
For us, it's about protecting people from displacement. So over the last 10 years, rents have actually doubled, which is more than any other German city. And I think it's causing a lot of existential angst and fear within the city. Deutsche Wohnen is one of the worst when it comes to this. They come into the neighborhoods and they buy up entire blocks of apartments. And what they do is they either let the apartments fall into disrepair and basically save on maintenance. And then after that, they basically try to kick out all of the renters through expensive renovations and raising the rent as well. So for us, we're saying, okay, if we put these apartments into public hands, renters would have a chance and would be able to make decisions over what would happen with their apartments as well. So we're saying it's a much more accountable institution rather than allowing these apartments to fall to predatory companies like Deutsche Wohnen.
Aren't you worried that if this goes ahead, if their nationalisation or expropriation, as you call it, goes ahead, then the risk is that there'll be even fewer new homes built? Because which company is going to come in and actually build new homes if this possibility of expropriation hangs over their heads?
This is actually something that's quite often, I would say, hung in front of us or people accuse us of. It's all about a distinction between who are the good investors and who are the bad investors. If you look at companies like Deutsche Wohnen and Vonovia, they build basically no apartments. Their number of apartments built in the last few years is zero. What they do is they come in and they buy up land, they raise the property prices, and through that they are able to make more money for their investors. So what we're saying is we need a reasonable apartment building policy within Berlin, but it's something that must be done socially, it must be affordable, it must be in the interests of existing renters as well.
But it still doesn't answer the question, who's going to build the new houses?
Actually, within the last few years, the public housing companies have built more apartments than in recent years. So for us, it's all about strengthening the public sector, I would say, in terms of housing, and also giving signal to other investors that if you are operating in the interest of the city, then you're also welcome here.
So you're keen then to keep Berlin poor but sexy, as a former mayor said?
For us, it's all about, I would say, protecting the renters. You know, it's the people of Berlin that really make the city what it is. Berlin is known for its Schnauzer. It's kind of tough love. They're curt, but they mean it kind of nice. But yeah, so
sharp but friendly.
I would say sharp but friendly. You know, kind of like your grandmother that is sassing you about being late, but she still loves you. You know.
Berlin is still a long way off other big metropolitan cities where, you know, housing has become an absolute crisis. I'm thinking San Francisco, Vancouver. I mean, Berlin is a long way off that. It is still, to a large extent, affordable, isn't it?
It depends on who you say affordable for. Within a lot of the communities that Deutsche Wohnen does buy up, these are low-wage earning people. They don't have anywhere else to go. And I think it's unfair to ask them to relocate outside the city, to give up their lives, to stop working and helping to hold the city together in terms of their jobs. These are nurses. These are people that work at schools. For me, it's also about holding the fabric of society together in the city as well. In terms of housing crises in other cities, I think you also have to consider that Berlin is still relatively poor in terms of wage comparison. So Tagesspiegel had a study that said Berliners give something like already 48% of their income out for housing, which is already extremely unhealthy. Wage growth within the city has not kept pace at all with rent prices. And for me, that's not tenable for the city as it is right now. So for me, it's a moment where we are really asking, you know, who is Berlin for? Is it for people that want luxury apartments, that want to speculate on the real estate market, or is it for the people that actually live here and create the city?
I was speaking there to Tom McGath in Berlin. Expropriation of housing may be a pretty extreme solution, but then many say the same about rent control. In fact, many economists generally advise against rent control. Are there alternatives then? Richard Florida is one of the world's leading urbanists, a professor in the University of Toronto's School of Cities and the Rotman School of Management.
I actually think it's a very simple issue. First of all, we have a global crisis of housing affordability in the advanced countries. There's a different crisis of housing in the global south, but in the advanced countries, the United Kingdom, Europe, the United States, Canada, and advanced Asia, there is no question about it. We have a global crisis of housing affordability. And the reason for that is in the knowledge economy, you know, we're in a post-industrial economy, we're in a knowledge economy where wealth and prosperity comes from ideas and innovation and people's minds. And that has to cluster. It has to cluster in places like San Francisco or Boston or London or Toronto or Berlin. What happens when things cluster? It drives up the price of land. You have tech companies and media companies and finance companies and people and super rich people and working people all competing for the same small slivers of land. And all of this clustering is taking place on, you know, less than 1% of the land area we have, as talent and ideas and knowledge and economic actors all compete and stuff themselves into that land. So it's a very simple problem. And there's actually some pretty basic solutions to get us out of it, but they seem to be politically difficult to execute.
So what are those political solutions?
A couple of things. One, we have to build more. We just have to get over this, people call it NIMBY, not in my backyard. I call it the new urban Luddism. You know, if we don't allow building, if we don't allow construction, if we don't allow taller towers, it's basically like the Luddites, you know, in the factories right in England, smashing the machines. Instead of smashing machines, we're destroying our cities. Secondly, we have to build more affordable housing and workforce housing. We can't just believe that if we build expensive condo towers for rich people, that will trickle down to workers. We have to build targeted social housing. affordable housing. In the United States, they call it inclusionary zoning. If you build an expensive tower in New York, 20 or 25% or 30% of the units have to be affordable housing. And, I think the real solution is that we have to move from a property tax to a land value tax. We have to tax people on the value of land because you're taxing the land when it's not used. The more you develop it, the less the tax. So it encourages development. So I think over time, we're going to have to move to a system of land value taxation.
So it's interesting, the solutions you've mentioned there, none of them mention rent control, none of them mention expropriation, the kind of things that people are campaigning for at the moment.
Well, look, both of those are terribly bad ideas from an economics point of view. Rent control, we know, tends to lead to housing running down, landlords not investing, and expropriation. It's a wonderful idea, but good luck pulling it off. But look, in the absence of innovative solutions, progressive solutions, in the face of extreme NIMBYism and housing affordability, what you are going to get is this political backlash, whether it's from the right or this kind of left-wing populism that people saying, I want rent control. I want you to take the housing and nationalize it and make it social housing. And that makes perfect sense to me because people are feeling that they're being thrown out of their communities. And look, probably the strongest emotional attachment we have after our family is the place we live. And if you threaten where people live, boy, oh boy, people are going to get upset.
Is there anywhere around the world that's getting it right?
No. This problem came on us very quickly. It's probably come on us in the past decade, this extreme what I call the new urban crisis, and its most pressing manifestation in this extreme crisis of housing affordability. And like anything, people have a wake-up call. But no one is getting it right because no one's wanted to take this seriously. And what we're seeing is the first inklings, really, of political movements around land. You think about the movements around workers' rights and unionizations that began in the 18th century and really gained steam in the 19th and 20th century. They took a while to gain momentum and for political actors to wake up and for governments to actually wake up and do something. We have less time now, but it's time for the wake-up call. It's time for the wake-up call and to understand that housing and housing affordability has become probably the signature issue. There's some debate about this. Some people say, well, it's economic inequality. But I think more and more people are beginning to understand that housing and housing affordability is probably the signal issue of our time. So it's time for the big wake-up call for political actors and political parties to begin to address this.
I was speaking there to Richard Florida of the University of Toronto School of Cities. It always comes back to taxes, doesn't it? In this case, perhaps a land value tax, as he suggests. That's it from this edition of Business Daily. Today's producer was Edwin Lane. I'm Manuela Saragosa, and Business Daily is back again at the same time tomorrow.